podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and I'm so delighted to welcome on Bryan Glosemeyer to talk about Beyond the Gates Infernal. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm super excited for it.
Oh my gosh, I am bursting with questions. But the most important one first. What's something great that happened recently?
Well, the first great thing is that I'm on the podcast. So thank you again very much for that. That is actually a huge deal for me. I'm very grateful for it. Second great thing, like we were talking about before, I have a birthday trip planned coming up. So it's not a great thing yet, but it's a great thing to be, where I'll be up visiting Vancouver for the first time and Seattle for the second time for my big 5-0.
Congratulations.
Happy early birthday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And hopefully the Pacific Northwest treats you well. But it will. It always does.
I love it up there, so I'm not worried at all.
Sarah, how about you?
My good thing is that I have a couple of buds on one of my rose plants that the deer did not eat. And so they've started blooming and they're very pretty.
Amazing.
Bambi gets quite a lot of my roses. So it's always exciting when you see a bud start to open and then you come out the next day and it's still there.
Oh, congratulations to you as well.
Thank you.
What color are the roses?
So it is the Lady Emma Hamilton rose, and it's kind of like this really pretty peachish color.
Ooh, I love orange flowers. We have some orange tulips right now. They're the best.
Nice.
Yeah.
My good thing is that we had a barbecue last weekend, first of the season. It was way too early. It rained all day. But I was like, no, we're still doing this, god damn it. Everyone humored me, and by the time food was done cooking, I was like, okay, we can go inside. But it was a lot of fun, so that was nice.
That sounds delightful.
Yes.
Yeah. So what is everyone drinking this evening? I have leftover from the barbecue sangria that I made that I thought would be more popular with people who aren't me, so I made way too much.
That was just taking care of, yourself in a couple of days' time.
Exactly. Planning ahead.
Indeed. I have box wine.
Secretly, that is also what I'm drinking, yes.
And I live in Northern California, so I'm drinking an IPA, because that's what we do.
It is required, yeah.
Binds of Death is the name of it. It's from Altamont Ghost Town. It's a West Coast IPA, and it's delicious. And they do like the cool, the people at home won't see, but you can see they have like cool skulls and stuff on the can. So
I do like the can.
I'm a sucker for skulls. What can I say? And it's quite tasty.
Oh, see, that's why they kicked me out of Northern California, because they were like, you don't drink IPAs, you can't stay here.
I just got into them. Like, I never drank them before, but then like a couple of years ago, I had one at a concert, and it just hit the right way at the right time. And that's pretty much what I've been drinking since then.
There you go. So this is actually a book podcast. Surprise!
Books.
Has anyone read anything good lately? Extracurricular, other than what we will be discussing at length in a moment. I haven't.
I read a short story called Gods of Dust by Bryan Glosemeyer and really enjoyed it. I finished Beyond the Gates Infernal yesterday and was like, I need more. And luckily there was more. So I read that and it was a delightful little treat.
I am about halfway through a book called Furious Heaven. It's the second book in a space opera trilogy that's not finished yet by Kate Elliott. It doesn't get a whole lot of buzz and talk, but it's kind of crazy that it's not because it's really good. The quick pitch for it is gender-swapped Alexander the Great in space.
Oh, shit.
So it's very deep world building, very big cast. Both books do start off kind of slow. Like, it takes about 100 pages for them to get going. But once they get going, it's like, boom, it's on. And we're just racing through. They're a lot of fun. I really highly recommend this series. Not enough people are talking about it, and I will definitely be posting about it once I finish it.
I have heard the title and that pitch too. And I really want to read it, but I just need to have more hours in the day.
Well, we always say we need to put more sci-fi on our list, so maybe we should just make it a podcast book, and then we have no excuse.
I'll add it to our list of podcast books.
It's fun. It's an interesting blend. It's got a lot of court intrigue mixed in with like military sci-fi and adventure, and then just also a lot of like cultural world building and mythological world building. It's actually a book that I feel like could use an appendices, like a dramatis personae and some stuff like that, and it doesn't have it. Because the cast is so big, I'm like, wait, who is this person again? But she's pretty good at like making sure that with this big cast that you catch on who and what you're reading about pretty quickly if you're lost for a second.
A book that also does that is The Shattered Gates of Heaven and Beyond the Gates Infernal. Thank you for the perfect segue.
Woohoo.
So I know that this episode is technically about the second book, but this comment applies to both. How fun the slang that you invented, like drilling instead of fucking and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It fits so perfectly into the world and was so well integrated into the dialogue and prose that it was like so easy to pick up. I was like, I know exactly what this character means.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that because I definitely put a lot of time trying to craft that just right because it's a culture that, that's very separated from our place and time and our history, but still has, antecedents to our own place and time and history. So just trying to think like, well, this character wouldn't say okay here, and they wouldn't say what in the world is going on, what would they say in place of that, and just trying to like immerse myself into the world and be like, well, what would be the natural thing someone would say in these kind of situations?
Did you start, like, keeping a dictionary of phrases, or was it all basically just in your head, like you had thought about it so you knew?
Oh, yeah, I keep copious notes. I have a terrible memory. I keep copious notes of, like, terms and, the different planets and worlds and what characters look like and what their backgrounds are. There's a really common writing software called Scrivener that I use that's great. So you can have all of your writing and your drafts and your notes just all in one location. So you can just click back and forth between a note and your draft that you're working on and look something up real quick and go right back to it. It's very convenient for people who do a lot of world building.
You do a hell of a lot of world building. So that was about the slang, which appears in the book as English, although of course they're not speaking English because this is a different time and place. But we also get quite a lot of alien language in these books. How did you develop those words and phrases?
So, one thing that kind of always bothers me with a lot of like space opera sci-fi is it's a little bit too easy to have everybody speaking English. And, there's always like the babblefish or some kind of like neural implant or something. And those kind of things do exist for some people in my world. But, I live in San Francisco, and it's so easy to ride the bus here and hear like 5 languages being spoken at once, in just a very small confined space. If you pay attention as you're going about the city, you can just hear dozens of languages being spoken. So it was hard to imagine why within the same culture, much less all these different cultures and aliens and people from different planets, wouldn't have a wide variety of languages too. So I really wanted to bring that, to the writing. And then from there, I was really trying to think about what the influences were on the different alien species and how that would reflect in the words. So, like with the Vlies, Sabira describes it as kind of a droning speech. So I thought it was important to have a lot of words with like long vowels. So you'll see there's a lot of like double E's and double U's as in 2 U's, not a W, and things like that in their words. And consonant combinations that we don't necessarily get in English flowing into each other in ways. And then, for the language of the unity, I wanted it to be something where, because like the construction of their mouths, it would be very hard for humans to speak it, so it would come across very kind of guttural and resonant sounding. And I took a lot of original inspiration in my world building as just like a stepping off point from like the Bronze Age and like the Fertile Crescent. So I wanted to have a language that would kind of trigger ideas of like, and Babylon and Persepolis and like kind of like Old Testament kind of sounding names and words to really resonate off of where I started with the world building on that.
And the language really does such a good job at grounding the reader in these different cultures. So I think you did an excellent job there. Talking a little bit about unity in particular, this is something that Lily and I discussed in our episode on the first volume. Because it opens from Sabira's perspective, and at that point she's still, we'll say, totally brainwashed by this culture that she's grown up in. And she doesn't recognize some of the many ways that it's bad, actually. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of writing from the perspective of someone who believes entirely in the righteousness of what they're doing without alienating the audience who is looking at it going, wait, but that's not a good thing that you're doing right now.
Right. Well, I remember on that podcast you were talking about that, and you said that you felt like you had to have like faith in the author that this kind of world building was going someplace. And on the other side of the coin, I had to have faith in the reader that, readers would understand that this kind of world building is going someplace and is serving a purpose and isn't supposed to be, theocratic propaganda that we're just supposed to buy into. So especially the first book, it's very much as it is an external story, like her external adventure, it's also a very internal story. So I knew where I wanted to go to with Sabira's big revelations in the middle of the book. That was always key to me for the first book. So I knew that I had to have a contrast to that. I knew where I wanted her to end up, so I had to get her in the exact opposite place, or very far from it, at least in the beginning, and build that out, and then make it very, very internal, very, very much from her personal point of view, and really try to avoid writing it in a way that made it seem like there was a third-person narrative or like a godlike voice saying this. So the reader would understand pretty early on that this is, Sabira's point of view and how Sabira is seeing things. And then also surround her with all the things that makes it clear that she really had very little choice but to think and feel this way. And we, early on in the book see what happens to people who dare not to think that way. They don't get much of a chance. So it was very much like wanting to establish that as the basis, have faith in the reader, hope it wasn't too weird. As a first-time author, it was just, any creative is always plagued with doubts, but there was a lot of doubts. I'm like, is this too weird? Is this too far out? Is this too dark? Most typical space operas have that, that Flash Gordon thing, that Star-Lord thing where it's the human from our time and place who gets thrown out into the galaxy, and so they're the fish out of water there. And then they encounter people who think weird and strange things by their point of view, and then to try to establish, like, no, this is a person who's already really far out, and we're going to see how they think and work and have to survive. And then just hope that people buy into it.
It's such a fascinating world. It really pulls you in and helps you along on that journey, for sure. In the foreword for book 2, you say that, someone could start here, which kind of blows my mind. How do you think a reader's experience would change if they start with book 2 and then go back to book 1?
Well, I don't think it's the ideal place to start. Like, I would prefer readers start with book 1. It is definitely a continuation. But I think we've all had times in our lives, especially I think if we were readers as kids, where you just kind of grab whatever book is around. And that may be book 2 or 3 or 10, in a series. And it's just what's there and that's what you want to read. So you pick it up and read it. So I did really try to establish as much right from the very beginning to give readers a sense when they pick up book 2 of what's happened to get to our characters here. and then, moving forward, and then also to tell a story that is the story of book 2. It doesn't end with a, huge cliffhanger. I didn't want it to feel like it was just one step in a longer story. Even though it is a story within a larger story, I wanted to make sure that each book felt like if you picked it up and read that, you would have a complete story from beginning to end. And also, there's just that kind of idea in storytelling that stories don't really have beginnings, unless you're going back to like Silmarillion, where we're starting with the beginning of the world. Everything picks up in some way or form in media res. So I wanted to let readers know if somehow this book came into your life and you picked it up, yes, it would be better to read book 1 first too, but I think if you start here, you'll have an idea of what's going on soon enough and be able to still enjoy it.
And it felt almost like mirroring book 1, because this book starts with Dagira, who, over the course of book 1, we meet and learn as Sabira's rival / eventual lover. But it sort of introduces us and starts us off in Unity, where they both came from, which I really appreciated, even having read book 1, to sort of reorient myself to this world, because it has been about a year, I think. Sarah, is that right?
It is almost right. We recorded our episode on Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven on June 22nd.
And so having that sort of callback to starting in, Unity, the culture that is so very, very different from our own and more than a little bit fucked up, rather than starting with Sabira, who has, started deconstructing and in this still different from our own world, but maybe more familiar, I think was a really nice, not callback exactly, but kind of.
Yes, that was actually, I did want to explore Dagera's storyline in book 2 as kind of the dark mirror of Sabira's storyline in book 1. After the failed invasion of Dlamacus that they were part of in first book, that was a big life-changing event for both of them. And so I feel like that's the kind of event where their lives are going like this, and then they kind of cross paths. They kind of take on, to a certain extent, each other's roles. Dagera wasn't as much of a true believer, and those events, reaffirmed her faith just as much as they questioned and eventually wrecked the faith of Sabira. And then I wanted to kind of establish that. And I also wanted to establish at the beginning of book 2 that there's a lot of things that happen that's outside of their volition, outside of their agency. But I wanted both storylines to begin with a choice. I felt it was really important that they each have a choice in the beginning that shapes all the things that happen after, whether or not it's within their agency or not. So that's why I decided I needed to backtrack a little bit in time to pick up with Dagera's story. Because even though we see that choice that she makes at the end of book 1 from Sabira's point of view, I wanted to retell it from Dagera's point of view, because that's the choice that she makes in this book that sets her on the path of things to come.
So when you started the series, when you started book 1, did you have a clear idea in mind for how you wanted to continue it in subsequent books? Were the events in book 2 always where you were going?
To a certain extent. My sense of what was happening in book 2 grew as I developed and edited book 1. So when I was first writing the very first draft of volume 1, I did not know if Dagera was going to live or die.
We didn't either.
I had to really sit and think about it, and I almost killed her off, and I felt like, no, I feel like I still need a foil for Sabira here. I feel like she still has a role. And then as the revision process continued for book 1, and as I started thinking more about what was going to happen in book 2, Dagera just became more and more demanding that she have a story told. So I'm really glad I didn't kill her off, because she had something that she needed to go through and something she needed to say.
We were looking over our notes for our episode on book 1 in preparation for this interview with you. And there's a note here, and I'm pretty sure that it's my note, but we don't say who writes which note in our episode outlines. And it says, the bulk of my notes go, oh no, Dagera's dead. Oh wait, she's not dead after all. Oh no, she's dead. Fooled again. So yeah, there were a lot of points where I was like, is she dead? But I'm glad that she wasn't, because I really, really enjoyed seeing how her journey is kind of like the dark mirror to Sabira's in this book. And it's really, like you're saying, kind of what Sabira could have been.
It's funny, I also, just going back a little bit to the earlier question, I almost ended book one on a cliffhanger. Like, I knew that once Daguerre lived, I knew that she was going to be sent back to stop their ship before they got to the gates. And then I knew basically what was going to happen with the Loshan Bastion. And I know we're trying to avoid spoilers a little bit too much for book two right now, but a certain character's father was going to be involved. And I was really debating as I was writing book one how many seeds I wanted to plant about that character's father in the first book. And I decided not to do any at the time. I just really wanted to focus on the story that was book one and let book two evolve on its own. And I didn't want to constrain myself with what was going to happen later. Because I'll have ideas, but they definitely develop and change over time and through revisions. And then I also was just like, yeah, I just don't want to end on a cliffhanger. So it was always my intention that like the beginning of Sabira's story in book two was going to happen that way. But I decided to wait and let that happen in book two, instead of ending on a cliffhanger and then being kind of constricted into telling the story and having it start exactly that way to see if maybe I wanted to switch things up when I'm actually in book two. I just didn't want to get too ahead of myself.
So I think there's only one last thing we can talk about before we have to move to the spoiler section, because I'm dying. But Unity is the civilization where we start. It's the civilization that Sabira and Daguerre were raised in, that they, sort of struggle with in different ways. And it has so many, like, cult-coded aspects to it. Like, just the way they weaponized personhood against people, like not even deigning to give them a name, and the control of information and misinformation was such a mindfuck to me. I can't even imagine someone living there.
Well, it does seem like it's very, different, but in so many ways, I mean, it was really inspired by our own history. A lot of the initial like springboard inspiration came out of history, especially like the Bronze Age. So there was a lot of ideas about, like kind of god kings and, high priests and rulers and pyramids of power. The whole idea of individual human beings, especially those who aren't directly related to whatever the political or religious institution of that culture is, having very limited personhood, up until very, very recent times in most of human history. So there was a lot of that to draw on. Obviously slavery has been a huge part of human history until very, very recently. So there was, those historical things that I drew on. I was very much, drawing on what we did in our world to establish this alien world. When we think about, the African American experience. Obviously me, middle-aged white man in America, can't say much about the African American experience, but we all know what happened, with the slave trade over centuries, and how their culture and history was violently ripped from them. Their names were changed, their music was taken away, their religions were taken away, but there was just these little seeds of things that remained within. And so I did plant some of those as well. As awful and alien as it is, it's not really that alien if you look at our own past. Everything that they did, we've done.
Maybe that's what makes it so compelling. It's so familiar in such an unsettling way.
Yeah, you just add in, giant three-eyed aliens and biomechanical tank beasts and a few spaceships.
Just a couple spaceships, one or two.
Gotta have spaceships. And I think that's why I didn't become a fantasy author. I needed my spaceships.
I think that's very valid.
We are about to move on to the spoiler section, where we can really talk about some of the crazy stuff that happens in this book. But before we do, we usually talk about who should read this book. And, I mean, the answer is obviously go read the first book first. It's kind of incredible how well they both stand on their own. I really appreciate the lack of cliffhanger. I didn't need it to want to read the next one. I wanted to read the next one because the world was good, and I wanted to know what happened to the characters. But Sarah, who should start reading this incredible science fiction series?
You should read this book if you want a dark story. I mean, okay, it's quite dark. I mean,
it's not hopeless.
It's not hopeless. I tend to veer more towards the cozy side of books, and this is definitely not that. But it has such a compelling cast of characters, and the journey that they all go on is so... There's a word that I'm looking for, because I don't want to use compelling again, but basically compelling. You are drawn into their struggles. So if you want to be just immersed in a science fiction novel, you should read this series.
And then it's not without its coziness. Bryan, you somehow create the most charming and adorable tiny little sci-fi critters for me to latch on to. In the first book, we had the Eashel, who is, I'm going to say, basically a cat, but with tentacles.
Well, I actually have something that I think will make you very happy. A big part of the inspiration for the Eashel is pugs and Frenchies.
Oh.
My heart! My heart!
I don't know if you remember, like, I described them as having very thick, wrinkly skin that they could kind of, like,
yes.
like pull themselves into the folds of their skin, and there was kind of like, and it had kind of a big round head and, like, stubby legs. So it has some very cat-like behaviors, but there's a lot of inspiration from those tiny little pugs and Frenchies, little stubby-legged round dogs.
Okay, so new headcanon, my pugs are actually Eashel.
Yeah, there you go. I didn't know I could love them more. And then in this book, we got the Vaidu, who were, I mean, they're technically combat critters, but every time they got attacked, I was just like, no, what are you doing? Why would you send them into battle? Send them home where they can curl up by the fire. It was very distressing.
With their limb-severing legs and...
That's cute. That's cute.
I don't know if that was intentional, but you killed me.
No, that wasn't intentional. I did not think that they would come across as cute, so that's actually pretty fun to hear. I know, like, Daguerre's character is one who grew up with animals. She grew up in the Aggie caverns, so doing some of the agricultural work of the Holy Unity, you know, where Sabira grew up with the diggers, you know, doing the mining and kind of the maintenance of the underground labyrinths. So she has a certain affinity with animals that a lot of the other characters doesn't have just by nature of her character. And so since we see a lot of the Vaidu through her perception, I think just her connection with it maybe is hopefully coming across.
I think it does shine through.
Our Patreon shout out for this episode is for Sean. Thank you, Sean, for all of your support. If you sign up for our Patreon, you can get access to bonus content. Our most recent post was reading 1-star reviews of The Hobbit and disagreeing with them vehemently. A huge thanks to all of our patrons for supporting us in making this podcast possible. And the remainder of this episode contains spoilers. So, okay, Bryan.
So everybody dies.
Yeah. You did such a good job of working all of the meaning behind the different alien titles that I didn't rely on the glossary as much as I realize I probably should have. I was lulled into a false sense of security. Because I got to the point in this book, I would say a little over halfway in, when we discover what was happening behind the Gods Fell, this super weapon, who had created it, what they had created it for, and it's told to me in very plain language, and I was like, oh no! I've suddenly realized I did not understand what was happening with this hierarchy and history as well as I thought I did. Would you help me? Would you explain to me like I'm an idiot who didn't read the glossary like she should have? There's like a lot of masters.
Yes. Well, there's two kinds of masters. There's the divine masters and the old masters. And for those of you who are following along at home, Sabira actually tells this story right at the beginning of her section of the book. So, in the deep history of the Holy Unity, or at least the deep mythology, what they tell people is that their civilization was originally this alien world that was ruled by a species who now is referred to as the Old Masters, and they were very technologically oriented. They were machine makers. And there was this ancient species called the Gates Builders, who, according to myth, are the ones who created the shattered gates that grace the title of the book, before they were shattered. And they would come through every few thousand years, bringing new gifts, kind of helping civilizations around the gates kind of advance a little bit further and then come back. And so they were expecting the gate builders to come through at this point a few thousand years ago, but instead of coming through bringing gifts, they come through bringing war. And we get, from the different stories and histories that we glean from the books, we realize that something happened in their civilization where a weird, for lack of a better term, death cult that thinks of themselves more as a life cult kind of took over that society. And when they came through demanding to be worshipped as gods. And they demanded that everyone follow a biological technology, putting aside machines. These old masters did not want to do that and went to war with these gods beyond the gates. The old masters were wiped out. According to the stories, all but 9 of them, who the gods saved and then remade into the divine masters. And then the divine masters created a holy unity society out of the rubble of their world. If we go back to the first book, you might remember there's some talk about the planet's surface is an inhospitable, lifeless wasteland. And that's why everybody lives underground. And the divine masters live in these domed palaces on the surface. They're domed because they can't live outside of the dome on this world. So this is kind of the leftover wasteland of the ancient war with the old masters and the gods. So when we get to the center of Loshan Bastion, we realize that this was actually a mining colony originally set up by the old masters to mine what we call god bones, or different people call it different things, but it's a made-up element that allows for faster than light space travel, artificial gravity, sci-fi stuff, that cool sci-fi shit that we all love. So they retreated there and started working on a weapon to take back their homeworld and defeat the gods. This weapon called Godsfell. But while they were working on it, the gates were shattered, causing a huge catastrophe which sealed them off from the rest of the galaxy and also severely injured and killed some of them. So what was left of them completed the weapon, God's Fall, but the mind of the machine was made up of their own bodies and minds. And since not all of them remained, the full mind of the Godsfell machine couldn't be brought online. So they basically went into a kind of almost mummified hibernation of just staying at the edge of life, waiting for their chance to get some kind of sentient being to fill in this space at the mind of Godsfell so that the weapon could be completed. Did that make sense?
It did, and I think I actually did follow more of it. I just wasn't confident that I understood.
Well, there's lots of myths and legends and people seeing things a certain way, are being told about things a certain way, through mythology. And then some people have done some studies and put together what they found out from the Vlees and trying to put the pieces together of what happened thousands of years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the doubt in myself, honestly, because it made me feel that much more immersed in the world, because it wasn't cut and dry exactly what happened. They were trying to figure it out, and I was right along there with the characters in that experience.
Changing gears just a little bit, one of the things that I really enjoyed was the different take on the found family trope. In both the first book and the second book. I think the first book is much more of a kind of straightforward found family, like Sabira finds these people in the Free Brood.
They kind of find her.
they kind of find her, yeah. And they all kind of come together as a unit. and support each other. And then in book 2, you explore, well, what happens afterwards? Like, things aren't always easy, and sometimes the adversity that brought a group of people together also pulls them apart. And so it doesn't necessarily end well, in the sense that after Zante is killed, Sabira is kind of ostracized. The people who are around her are like, you promised to protect him and you didn't fulfill that promise. We don't know how to deal, so we're just not going to deal with you. And even at the very end, Playa, Zante's lover, is like, sorry, you're out. You clearly didn't care about us enough. And so I thought that was just fascinating, because it's something that we don't see a lot with that trope.
Well, yeah, one of the things I really wanted to make important is, there's a lot of characters who die in my books. There's a lot of death. And I didn't want any of these deaths to just be, oh, well, they're dead, we move on. The story continues. I think I wanted, when somebody you care about dies, it changes you for the rest of your life. And I wanted to reflect that. And all of these characters have deep, lifelong traumas, and they're all at a point in their lives where they're just starting to heal. I think at one point, Playa tells just a little bit of her story to Sabira, when she's just right on the edge, and what Zante, meant to her, and to have that taken from her, there's no consoling her. There's nothing Sabira can do to justify or console or do anything that will heal what Playa is going through, and they are this found family, they're all kind of forced together, in a spaceship, in a sanctuary later on in the book, and just having to deal with this tremendous loss and trauma, and then every day waking up and looking at a person that you think is directly responsible for your trauma, and what that's going to do. So I just felt it was really, really important to not have, character deaths just, oh, they're dead, move on. I feel like I wanted each death to actually mean something, not only to the main character, but to the side characters as well. I wanted to try to establish, even if we don't necessarily follow every step, I want you to see that the other characters, in the story, the other people in Sabira's life are also going on their own journey and going through their own ups and downs and revelations and discoveries about who they are and what they want, and their own healing or not healing process.
It feels a little silly to say this after we mentioned how in the first book with Dagira, we were constantly like, oh, she's dead, wait, she's not dead. Oh, she's dead, wait, she's not dead. But when a character dies, they're done. There's no hand-wavy, wand-waving sci-fi answer to, oh no, it's fine, they're back. Which made it feel that much more, realistic, but also impactful to the reader, who, sometimes readers get used to having everything get wrapped up all neatly, and everyone lives and everything's fine at the end.
I wouldn't have minded if Zante hadn't died. I was so sad.
It was very sad.
But I do think that for the purposes of the book, it made much more sense, and it made for a better story, but I was sad.
I was sad too. After I wrote that, I had to take some time. That was a hard one to write, and then to write, the grief of the characters and the grief of Playa. That was hard. That one took a lot out of me too, to be honest with you.
Was that always your intention, that Zante would die in this book?
No. It was always my intention that somebody was going to die. It was originally going to be someone else. And as I was writing, I was like, this doesn't feel quite right. This isn't the one who needs to die. It needs to be Zante.
Was it Spear?
It was Cal. I was going to kill off Cal.
Oh, shit.
That was my original intention. But then I was like, no, I still have a story for Cal. There's going to still be things for him. Not that there wouldn't still be a story for Zante, but it made more sense for the story for Zante to be where he was when he died, to be in that situation than it would be for Cal. And so I would have to I didn't want to ever have to force things in order to fit an agenda. I have an idea of where I want the story to go, but I feel it's very important for the story to unfold organically. And we can all feel when an author is forcing something to happen. We all go, it happened because reasons, because we need it to happen.
Yeah.
And I didn't want that. I wanted everything to feel, surprising yet inevitable.
I also have to say that I'm really glad that it was not Cal who died, because we get to see, and this is really a very background thing, but as Cal works through his grief over Zante's death, like, he's initially very angry with Sabira, and then we get to see him kind of have a reconciliation of sorts, and they come back together. And that felt very rewarding, particularly when you contrast it with Playa's reaction. And it just really helped show the variety of responses that a group of people can have to the death of someone close to them.
Yeah, we all handle grief in different ways. And, Playa had a very unique relationship with Zante. They were deeply, deeply in love from a culture where love isn't really a thing that's allowed to happen. And also, Cal just kind of became, in this found family, like Sabira's little brother. And she has a real hard time. She's very gruff. She's a warrior. She has a lot of emotions, but she's not one to just like open up about her emotions. But there's something about Cal where she can sit and talk with him in a more vulnerable way. For whatever reason, they just have that rapport. If they were in our world, they would be, sitting on the dorm room floor together at 1 a.m, telling each other their life story. They just have that rapport. And so, he is the one that she can have that kind of connection to. Which is good, because in a book we're going on for hundreds of pages to just have like, a grim, taciturn hero who only, who's like Clint Eastwood and only says, 1 or 2 lines and then moves on. It's fun for a 2-hour movie, but when you're spending hundreds of pages with the character and you're going through all this stuff, you want to be able to have someone that they can open up and talk to and make some connections with.
Speaking about love in Unity, where it's not exactly encouraged, you have written the most incredible love story between Sabira and Dagira that does not at all fit the stereotypical romance arc. I even hesitated. I asked Sarah, can I even call it a love story? I think you can. I think it counts.
I think it counts. I wouldn't. Yeah, it doesn't follow romance art because romance, capital R genre romance, has very specific milestones that you need to hit, and I'm not trying to work on those milestones per se. There's probably a few that I hit along the way, just because they're the natural progression of a love story. And like I was saying, like Daguerre was just one of those characters that just kept saying, "No, I'm in this story. I have something to do here." Like, she just kept surprising me at every turn. And so a lot of that was just the characters organically going through their stories together, and what they mean to each other, what their own flaws and needs and wants and revulsions are, and how that turns out, and how, like I said earlier, how, the failed invasion of Telemachus just sent them both in exact opposite directions, but there was still so much unreconciled there as well. And, one thing I really wanted to explore a lot in the themes of this book, of book 2, is honestly the nature of consciousness and the waking conscious versus the unconscious, and how our unconscious drives us in ways that for many of us we're completely unaware of. And Daguerre is especially that character. Like, Sabira has started to do the work, through the Eon ceremonies and everything, of becoming more in touch with, her inner self, where Daguerre has absolutely not done that work. And what drives her and moves her is a stranger to herself. And that's also very much reflected in just how the God's Fall works. They needed somebody to be on top, to be like the conscious experience of God's Fall, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be the one who is in charge of God's Fall, as we kind of explore there. So Daguerre both loves Sabira, and by the time we get, deep into this book, is deeply ashamed of her love for Sabira and has a hard time facing both of those facts about herself.
Oh, every moment when she gets corrected because she refers to Sabira by her name, even though Unity has decreed her an apostate and no longer gets a name, I just, my heart throbbed for her. Just oh my god. It was very sweet. It was very sweet and sad.
I felt so bad for Daguerre and the way that her will is constantly being taken from her in this book. Mm-hmm. She's constantly being subjected to the whims of other people and loses her own ability to make choices. And I felt sad for her.
She's always trying to have agency and then just having it ripped away.
Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which was why I realized it was so important to begin her story with her making a choice. If she had chosen to kill Sabira when the Zolari was falling apart around them, or if she had chosen to go with Sabira, as Sabira was begging her to do, she would have had a very, very different life trajectory. But, she made this choice at this very key pivotal point in her life, and it changed everything afterward for both of them. And I think it was just really important to establish that, knowing that there would be so much taken out of her hands later.
That one decision has repercussions.
Is that the tagline for the books? That one decision you made, it's got repercussions.
And we're all in that situation all the times. We all don't know what one decision we make will change everything. A lot of times we kind of feel it am I going to go to this college or that college? Am I going to marry this person or not marry this person? We all make those choices, but sometimes there's just little choices that we make to turn left instead of right that could change everything, and we have just absolutely no idea at the time, and may never even know looking back on it, but it was there.
You mentioned Daguerre sort of acting as a foil for Sabira across this book, but another character that really stood out to me in a similar but different role was Grandfather Spear. We meet him in book 1. He's sort of a mentor figure, kind of, as much as you can get in their society. And then in this book, we see him not fall from grace exactly, but he goes through his own trauma and reconciliation from the events of book 1 and deals with them very differently from either of our two, Daguerre and Sabira.
Yeah, absolutely. Grandfather Spear was someone that I kind of always knew I wanted to keep going through the story as the books go on. And he is a mentor, and he is given, the quite literal privilege of being a mentor in ways that most people in their world are not, and an ability to establish at least some kind of family ties in ways that other people are not. His daughter became the handmaiden, the highest ranking of all the humans in the Holy Unity, and they're very much kind of grooming Sabira to potentially take that place, or at least eventually become, very, very high ranking in some way herself. And he's also a man of deep, deep faith, much of the faith that Sabira has. Yes, it's forced on her by society, but it's also, taught to her by example from her grandfather. And the way that most people who grew up in a religious family is, you learn by example. And we often pick up faith from the elders in our family. And what happened to him didn't necessarily break his faith, but it did break him.
That blew my mind when we got to that part of the book. I'm sorry, I had to
interrupt. Please. Yeah.
Because he asks basically to be deconstructed in not so many words, but he's undergone this physical and mental augmentation that sort of takes away some of his sense of self. And I thought for sure when he was please undo this, obviously that meant that he was mad at the people who did this to him, but no, he was still completely faithful, and it was interesting reading that. It felt right for him, but I was still okay, I misread this vibe.
Right, I think, when people leave a religion, it's usually in their teens or 20s. It's not in their 60s. I don't know if someone can really change a deeply held faith by that age. I don't want to say it's impossible because, the human mind is capable of so much, but it's pretty unlikely. His faith is deeply ingrown, and it also comes back to choice. I think for himself and his interior world, he saw his faith as his choice. He chose to take this path to become originally a pit fighter and then a servant and work his way up through the servants. And he chose to give his faith and his devotion, to the gods. And when they undergo that transfiguration at the beginning of book 2, his ability to give his faith to his leaders and to his gods has been taken from him. Now it's a force thing. For him, it's the one thing that he has always had a choice in, and it was his choice to give himself over to a greater cause. And now he didn't even have that. Now that even that was taken from him. And then seeing what happened, with his granddaughter, with Sabira, whom he in his own very dark and twisted way, deeply, deeply loved. He was broken. And he, again, I think, wasn't aware of what he would do in that situation until he was suddenly in it. I don't think he went into that pursuit of Sabira and the other free brood with the intentions to, betray the war seer, Nika, and asked to go over to their side. But when it came to this point where it became like, Nika's life or Sabira's life and everything that had happened to him, his choice was made from that deep unconscious part of himself that he probably wasn't fully aware of. And then afterwards, we see that he doesn't necessarily say the words, but I think we can see that he has a lot of guilt and question about what he did. And he's ready for Sabira to flush him out the airlock. Going forward, he has to figure out what it means to live now in this new way, in this new context, but still be true to who he felt he always has been. I also felt it was really important for him not to be a foil necessarily to Sabira, but for him to be a foil to Gabriel. Gabriel was definitely trying to teach Sabira a new kind of ethics and a new kind of way of seeing the world and being in the world. And, her grandfather was still very much the voice on the other part and on her left shoulder saying, this isn't who you are. This isn't how you were raised. This isn't, well, look what they're doing to you. Where's your weapons? You've earned those weapons. Why are they doing this to you? They're trying to keep you from being a warrior. You're a warrior. You're not someone who's just going to, accept the way things are. You're going to go out and change it. You're going to, make things happen for yourself because that's what the gods taught us. I got some feedback from a beta reader that Spear should have been killed off, and I'm like, no, I need him to be that voice, that foil to what Gabriel has to say, so that Sabira has her own choices about how to resolve things at the end of the book.
Absolutely. Oh my god.
Yeah, I think that his presence is really important to Sabira figuring out what she wants to do and who she wants to be. You can't kill him off.
And then there are some really tender moments between them in this book where it really feels like he's the only person in this sanctuary where they all end up for a period of time that understands what Sabira is going through. And even if he doesn't agree with her choices, he still at least gets where she's coming from in a way that it feels like no one else around her does.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that there's a lot of, there's a few moments where they just look at each other and they can just kind of have an unspoken communication and understanding. And it also serves to drive the wedge even deeper with Playa, because not only does she have to wake up every day and see the face of Sabira, who she blames at least in part for Zante's death, but she has to wake up and see the face of the man who's directly responsible for Maya's death, from the first book, who they all deeply loved and admired, and who helped set them, not only their bodies free, but helped set their minds free as well.
Changing gears a little bit, I have a very stupid question.
I'll try to give you my stupidest answer.
What was up with Warseer Zika and the lizard pimples? Was that just world building? It was so visceral.
Oh, her little amphibian thing? Yeah.
Her snack. It was a snack.
So their technology is all biologically based. especially with using life forms for their own means, like exploiting life forms. So it was actually a drug.
I definitely got the feeling she was addicted to it, or like she was doing it for some physiological reason to control something. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a kind of a combat drug for her. It was a kind of a stimulant.
See, that's a perfect example of I was sitting there reading it going, I know there's something happening here. I don't know what it is. But I know for a fact there's a reason.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I was like doing a little bit of showing and not telling. Because there was no reason to tell. Like, Zika wouldn't just stop what she was doing and explaining her, amphibian boiled drugs that she's taking before stressful situations. But I did try to portray that she had like sort of a physiological reaction, like her eyes would kind of roll back and she'd close her eyes and tilt her head back a little bit. And it was also just not necessary for the reader to know what it was, just that it was happening and it was in the world. I feel like not every little thing needs to be explained. Sometimes things are just there and you can kind of get the vibe of what's going on. But if you don't pick up on the exact idea that this is like a stimulant combat drug for her, that's fine. It doesn't change anything.
I agree completely, but I have you here, so I was like, well, I have you. I'm gonna ask.
Oh, and I'm happy to dig into it because, like I was saying earlier, I've never had a chance to really go into a spoiler discussion yet about book 2. So I'm happy to just be able to like say things no holds barred. The big thing that I've been really itching to share with the world, honestly, was the fact that the theme of this book was really, or one of the themes, there were multiple themes, was the idea of consciousness and the unconscious and the things that motivate us that might make us, strangers to ourselves, and some of the great work that we can do in life is to try to unify that conscious and unconscious part of ourselves to at least make a little bit more sense of why we are these weird beings that we are. So that was a big part of it. I also don't know if I necessarily want to say it if you guys didn't get it, but there's also a mythological motif that I used to structure a lot of book 2 that I kind of wove through a lot of different things in different ways, and I was just wondering if that got picked up on at all or not.
Now I'm trying to think.
I'm gonna guess not. That's fine. It's not explicit. It's just one of those things that I kind of put into the structure of things and kind of like little moments that were there. And it's not like you have to know it, but it's just like a common mythological trope or mythological story that I use to just add a little structure to both the physical story and the metaphorical story that was happening.
Well, now I'm going to have to reread it.
Well, I think this means we have to reread, but also I think it means that we need to read more mythology.
Yeah.
It's probably one you would be familiar with. It's actually, I'm not a mythology expert by any means. So it's a pretty common Greek myth.
So now I'm embarrassed because I read so many Greek myths as a kid. Maybe that's the problem. I just know the like sanitized kid versions. I'll have this existential crisis off screen.
And again, it's not too deep. It was just, a structuring idea that I used that I was just kind of peppering in here and there. And I was just wondering, because you guys are very close and attentive readers. I was really moved by your podcast about book 1, like how much you were pulling from it. I was like, they get it. Yes, they get it. Because as a writer, you're alone in your room, just like putting all these words on the page. Like we talked about before, the readers to a certain extent have to trust the writer, and a writer to a certain extent has to trust the reader, that I'm not just going to hold your hand for every little thing and over explain it like it was, like a CW episode that you can have on in the background.
Yeah, that you don't have to pay attention to. Yeah. Well, I absolutely loved these books, and it sounds like there might be more. So I do have a short story that I get to look forward to. And it sounds like there might be some more also coming in this world.
Yes. So the short story is Gods of Dust. It's set in the Shattered Gates universe. It's not required reading, but it does add a little bit more context to what happens at the end and some of the things that are mentioned. But it's a very separate story in kind of place and time.
I would say that it's basically a standalone. Like, you don't need to have any context for the first 2 books to read it and enjoy it. But if you have read those books, then you recognize that some of the things that happen in this short story. And it's like, I think on Kindle it's like 25 pages. Like they are referenced in book 2.
Yes. Quite a bit. There's some key things that are referenced and happen in book 2 that this short story adds a little bit of. So if anybody out there wants to get their hands on Gods of Dust, you can get it for free by going to my website, bryanSglosemeyer.com. And if you sign up for my monthly newsletter, I will send you that short story for free. I'll also send you the beginning of Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven for free, so you can get a little sample of that and see if this is something you want to continue on with. So yeah, once you finish Gods of Dust, you'll have to reach out to me and let me know what you thought of it.
Well, I for one can say that I loved it. Can you tell us a little bit about what your next projects are? Like the end of Beyond the Gates Infernal, there was definitely a very satisfying conclusion, right? But I would say that it's also left a little open-ended. Do you intend on leaving it up to the reader to imagine what Sabira and everyone else does next? Or do you plan on writing more in the universe?
Yeah, I do, and am working on writing more. I'm not far enough along in the project to say too much about it yet. Yeah, so each book is intended to be its own story, to give you a satisfying ending that's also open-ended for stories to continue. And there's definitely more story that I would like to tell. You know, we finally got Sabira to the constellation, and we just got a little glimpse of what the constellation is. So I do intend to start telling more stories set in the constellation and what's going on there, the tensions between the constellation and the Republic, the tensions between the second diaspora and the third diaspora, the fallout of the God's Fall incursion that happens at the end of book 2, what Sabira plans to do with her freedom. I give a little hint of what she might decide at the end of book 2, but I did kind of leave that open because she is still figuring things out for herself. So yeah, I'm still working on things. I do intend to write more books, not only telling Sabira's story, but I do intend to write just other stories in this universe, because I try to set up, like, there's a lot of the universe that I've worked on and set up that hasn't shown up really in the 2 books yet, that I want to explore and just be able to tell a lot of different kind of stories in this universe that aren't necessarily the stories of these characters, but I do intend more for Sabira and friends. And at this point now, it's been a little daunting because these 2 books have been very focused on getting Sabira from A to B, and now that she's to B, like, the story kind of like starts splitting off in lots of different directions, and I don't want to George Martin myself. So I'm working on getting that all wrangled and together and trying to figure out how that's all going to fit. So no set things about what's next or when yet, but it's a work in progress.
Well, I'm just glad I have more to look forward to. Bryan, before we let you go and get back to your evening, where can our listeners find more information about these books and hear news about when the next one might be cooking?
Oh, yes. So like I said, BryanSglosemeyer.com is my website. You can sign up for my newsletter there. That is often the most kind of direct line into my brain and what's going on with me, what I'm enjoying, what I'm creating, and just recommendations that I have. It's very low-key, just a monthly little chat of a newsletter that I put out. Also, I am on social media. I'm mostly on Instagram. My Instagram handle is DoomBunnyBryan, but if you look up Bryan S. Glosemeyer, that will also get you to me. There I talk about the books that I'm reading and music I'm listening to, travels that I'm doing, life around San Francisco. So always feel free to reach out to me there. I'm very, very approachable. I'm also on Facebook under Bryan S. Glosemeyer, and I'm technically on Blue Sky, but honestly, I haven't been on there in a long time. I'm pretty sure it's Bryan S. Glosemeyer on Blue Sky as well.
I just remembered another dumb question I have.
Have at it.
New SF. Is that New San Francisco SF?
Yes! Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I had an inkling.
I don't think anybody, at least if anybody's caught it, they haven't pointed it out to me that they caught it. Yes.
Well, I'm glad I asked then.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
We also have a Patreon, where you can support us and find exclusive episodes and a lot of other nonsense.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated.
Bye.